In a small provincial town, the community of Silverstone had always been quiet, almost asleep in its routine. Life there seemed peaceful, punctuated by the seasons and the little habits of the inhabitants. Yet that day, an incident would mark a turning point in the city, transforming lives and revealing truths buried for too long, truths that until then had been carefully hidden beneath the quiet surface of the community. Sarah, a young mother with a determined look, was going with her son Lucas to the local supermarket for a quick shopping trip. The cool morning wind caressed their skin as they walked to their car, bags filled with fresh vegetables and household items. Lucas, an 8-year-old boy with a mischievous smile, was jumping happily next to her, making the atmosphere lighter. But everything would suddenly change. As they reached their vehicle, the sound of rapid footsteps was heard behind them. A police officer, Officer Miller, approached suddenly. He looked agitated, like something was wrong. His normally impassive face was marred by an expression of stress, his furrowed brows and trembling hands faintly visible in the glare of the morning sun. In an instant, everything seemed to freeze. "Your ID now," he ordered Sarah abruptly, his harsh voice cutting through the peaceful air around them. His eyes searched Sarah with an almost menacing intensity. She, visibly surprised, stopped short and replied, "Why do you want my ID card? I didn't do anything." The innocence of his response only increased the tension in the air, as if the already strange situation was going to get even more complicated. Agent Miller did not respond. Instead, he grabbed her arm in a firm grip, his fingers clenching around her skin, as if he already considered her guilty. Sarah jumped under the pressure, a rush of adrenaline coursing through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. Lucas, frightened, began to tremble beside him, his little eyes wide open, staring at the scene with palpable terror. He had the impression that the world around him had just fallen into a whirlwind of violence and incomprehension. "No, I'm not going to let you do that," Sarah said, her voice suddenly louder, firmer, as if drawing strength from the motherly love that compelled her to protect her son. "You have no reason to arrest me." The tension rose another notch. Officer Miller, visibly annoyed by Sarah's resistance, raised his baton in a threatening gesture, brandishing it in front of her, ready to shoot her. The sound of the baton striking the air seemed to echo in the heavy silence that had settled around them. The situation was becoming more and more tense. Fear and uncertainty could be seen on the faces of the witnesses. It was as if the invisible barrier of public order had collapsed, giving way to a scene of brutal and absurd confrontation. But Sarah, although shocked, did not give in. She understood that what was at stake was not just her freedom or her right to defend herself. It was much bigger than that. "I'm not going to let you do this," she repeated in a strong and determined voice, her gaze challenging the agents. "You have no reason to arrest me. You can't do this." Each word seemed to weigh heavily, like a declaration of war against injustice. Then a familiar sound was heard, the growing murmur of the crowd forming around them. Spectators, many of whom were already filming the scene on their phones, had approached, their attention drawn by the incident. They watched from afar, some whispering among themselves, others filming hoping to capture every moment, every detail. The scene seemed almost unreal, a collision between the peaceful daily life of the city and the brutality of a police confrontation. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, a rumor spread, some beginning to openly criticize the agent's attitude, others wondering if there was a reason for this attack. Voices were raised, some daring to approach, others more cautious, content to film and observe. Agent Miller, feeling that the situation was getting out of control, tightened his grip on Sarah's arm, but she, still more determined, did not flinch. She knew that the outcome of this moment would decide much more than just her own life. A young woman, Anna, slipped through the crowd. As a local activist, she had often witnessed similar behavior from law enforcement, and she was no longer willing to remain silent. As he approached Agent Miller, his normally calm face changed into a determined expression. She knew that this moment could change the course of the day, and perhaps even, ultimately, that of the entire community. "What you're doing here is not right. "You are abusing your power, sir," she said out loud, her voice firm and forceful. The tension rose instantly. The murmurs in the crowd became more insistent, some supporting Anna's words, others remaining silent, their eyes glued to the stage, waiting for Agent Miller's reaction. But before a reaction occurred, a second police officer appeared, Sergeant Thomas. Unlike Officer Miller, Sergeant Thomas had a reputation for being fair, calm, and thoughtful. He was known around the city for having a measured approach to tense situations, and many residents appreciated him for his ability to listen before acting. When his eyes landed on the scene, he stopped in his tracks, observing the intensity of the situation. He immediately noticed the commotion in the crowd and the look of fear on the face of Lucas, the young boy standing next to his mother. After a moment of reflection, the sergeant turned towards Sarah and the crowd, which was beginning to get agitated. His voice, although firm, was calm and collected, an attempt to restore order without unnecessary exacerbation. "What's going on here?" he asked in a manner that betrayed his crisis management experience. Sarah stood up slowly, her body tense, but her gaze implacable. She did not let herself be intimidated, quite the contrary. She knew that the outcome of this confrontation would determine not only her own safety, but also the integrity of what was right. "This officer stopped me for no reason, grabbed my arm, and threatened me with his baton. I am just a mother to my son, and I did nothing wrong," explained she, her voice firm and clear. She did not allow herself to hesitate, because she knew that everything she said would be listened to with particular attention by the witnesses and the sergeant. The spectators, witnessing the scene, began to become more agitated. Murmurs ran through the crowd, voices rising in the air, some expressing support for Sarah, others accusing Officer Miller of unjustified violence. Tensions were palpable, but the situation was beginning to take a turn. A man from the back of the crowd, visibly bolder than the others, took out his cell phone. "I filmed the whole scene," he said, approaching Sergeant Thomas. "Look, Sergeant. It's all there." He held his phone out towards the officer, the video clearly showing Officer Miller grabbing Sarah's arm and brandishing his baton in a threatening manner. The video, of indisputable clarity, showed the attack in detail, without the slightest ambiguity. Sergeant Thomas watched the video in silence, his gaze hardening as the images passed before him. The expression on his face grew darker, each image adding weight to the heavy responsibility that rested on him. He looked back at Agent Miller, then back at the video. It was a blatant violation of the rules and values he defended. After a long moment of silence, he said in a calm but sharp voice, "Agent Miller, you are suspended immediately." The crowd, which had been holding its breath during the sergeant's assessment, burst into cheers. Shouts of relief, joy, and support for Sarah were heard, while Agent Miller, visibly embarrassed and caught off guard, tried to protest. He opened his mouth, trying to justify his actions, but he knew it would do no good. The truth was obvious. Sergeant Thomas walked slowly towards him, and with a decisive gesture, he took his badge and his baton. Agent Miller's face fell, his expression a mixture of humiliation and suppressed anger. He had no choice but to withdraw, handing over the symbols of his authority with bitter resignation. The sergeant then turned to Sarah and Lucas. His look was full of sincerity and regret. "I'm sorry for what you went through," he said softly, leaning slightly toward Sarah, as if to show his solidarity. "You did the right thing. We will investigate and take action." He paused, then added, a little more firmly, "We will not allow this to happen again." Sarah nodded, but her face remained serious. "What I want," she replied in a calm but resolute voice, "is for this not to happen to anyone else." There was a glint of defiance in his eyes, a determination that would not die until this injustice was completely righted. In the following days, video of the incident went viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. Thousands of people, revolted and united, shared it, viewing it and sending it to their friends, families, and colleagues. Within hours, the incident had become a national affair. The discussions ignited the forums, comments, and online press articles. The debate over abuse of power in the police, already a sensitive and largely ignored subject, took on a scale that none of them could have predicted. The media covered the incident, reporting not only the brutality of Sarah's attack, but also highlighting her indomitable courage in the face of oppression. They described her as a mother who had acted to protect her child, but also as a figure of hope in a system often blind to injustice. Reports about the affair were everywhere, and journalists came from all over to interview Sarah. Thousands of voices, from all walks of life, were raised to demand a profound reform of the police and a review of police practices. At first, Sarah was reluctant to come forward publicly. She never wanted to be a media figure or embody a movement. But very quickly, she understood that her story resonated far beyond her own experience. Invitations to forums, television shows, and community events poured in. She finally agreed to speak, not for herself, but for those who, like her, had suffered in silence, too often silenced by injustice. In her public speaking engagements, Sarah spoke about the system of power that allowed some to abuse it, about how people, because of their position, could manipulate the law to their advantage. His message was simple but powerful. What I did to protect my son. But we must all stand up when justice is threatened. No one should be afraid to stand up for what is right. His words, imbued with quiet courage, inspired hundreds of people to join the conversation about police reform. She also explained that, despite the pain and fear, we must resist and ensure that each individual has the right to live without fear of the abuse of power. Lucas, who had watched his mother stand proudly in the face of injustice, began to grow up with a new understanding of what true strength meant. At school, he became a small voice of justice. His comrades listened, fascinated, as he told the story of that day, and he encouraged them to use their voices to fight against all forms of injustice. Courage isn't about fighting with fists. Sometimes it's just about telling the truth, he explained to them with astonishing wisdom for a boy of his age. He didn't just repeat his mother's words. He lived them. He spoke openly about the incident at school, inspiring his peers to question what was fair and unfair in their own community. Lucas had become a symbol of this new generation, a generation that refused to remain silent in the face of injustice, no matter its magnitude. At Silverstone, change began to manifest itself, slowly but surely. The city, once silent, was waking up to the reality of its fractures. Residents spoke more openly to each other, sharing their own experiences of injustice, whether related to the police or other aspects of their daily lives. Community meetings were held, and people came together to discuss how they could act together to create a more just and equitable environment. They no longer wanted to be passive witnesses to injustice, they wanted to be agents of change. Local authorities, under increasing pressure from the community and the media, began to review their practices. Their responses were slow, but there was an apparent willingness to change. Training was introduced for police officers, focusing not only on the technical aspects of the law, but also on empathy, conflict management, and active listening. There were also efforts to improve communication between law enforcement and citizens, a first step toward difficult but necessary reconciliation. What started as a simple act of resistance in a parking lot grew into a movement for broader change. Sarah, despite her central role in this struggle, sought neither glory nor recognition. She had just acted like a mother. But through her actions, she had opened a breach in the wall of silence and indifference. Thanks to technology and Lucas' determination, a video shared millions of times, a once silent city found itself at the forefront of a crucial conversation about justice, equality, and police accountability. The order. The changes at Silverstone were not just limited to police practices. The community, awakened by the incident, understood that more than legislative reforms were needed to eradicate systemic injustices. A change in mentality was needed, a collective desire to question norms and open our eyes to what had long been tolerated. Thus, a peaceful but sleepy town was transformed. The courage of a mother and the commitment of a little boy inspired a revolution of thought in a community where, until then, injustice seemed invisible. This movement was only just beginning, and it would be a long road, but the seeds of change had been sown. The winds of change were blowing through Silverstone, and it brought with it a brighter, fairer future for all.